In 2008, a crew of experienced sailors built a replica of the Argo, 94 feet of hand-hewn Aleppo pine, 50 oars, a single square sail. They launched from the harbor at Volos on the eastern coast of Greece, which sits on the site of ancient Iolcus, the city where the original Argo was said to have been built roughly 32 centuries ago. Their plan was to retrace the mythological voyage, south through the Pagasetic Gulf, into the Aegean, up through the Dardanelles, and the Sea of Marmara across the Black Sea, and east to the coast of modern Georgia. Approximately 1,500 miles by the most direct route, roughly the distance from New York to Denver. Much more if you account for the way real ships actually move. Hugging coastlines, tacking against wind, waiting out storms in sheltered harbors while the days burn away. The replica sank. How do you fail to build something that Bronze Age craftsmen built with hand tools? Not catastrophically, no one died, but the hull flexed in ways that modern naval engineers had not predicted. The oar ports leaked. The sail could only catch wind from directly behind the vessel, which meant that any breeze not perfectly aligned with the direction of travel was useless, or worse. The crew, strong and trained, found they could sustain the rowing pace necessary for real forward progress for about 90 minutes before exhaustion took over. 90 minutes. The mythological voyage lasted months, so the modern world tried to build the ship, and the modern world failed. We couldn't do it. With power tools and naval architecture software and 3,000 years of accumulated shipbuilding knowledge, we couldn't do what Bronze Age Greeks did with hand tools and pine resin. That is interesting on its own, but there is a deeper problem with the Argo, one that no amount of engineering can solve, and it is this: the ship was built for the wrong man. We'll come back to that, to why, specifically, this man did not deserve this ship. Hold on to that number 2. 90 minutes. Because the mythological crew rowed for days, and the gap between what modern bodies can do and what the myth claims is part of what makes this story impossible to dismiss as fiction. Here are 2 things I want you to hold in mind tonight, because we are going to come back to both of them. The first is a piece of wood. One beam in the prow of the Argo was cut from the sacred oak grove at Dodona, the oldest oracle in Greece, older than Delphi, a place where Zeus spoke through the movement of leaves and wind. That beam could talk, not metaphorically. The ancient sources are specific and consistent. The beam of Dodona had a voice. It issued prophecies. It warned of danger. It argued with the crew. A piece of processed wood that could think and speak and form opinions, and at the very end of this story, that beam falls silent. Its final silence is, I think, the saddest moment in all of Greek mythology. We will get there. The second is a woman named Medea. You may have heard her name before. If you listened to our entry on Talos, the first robot in history, you heard what she did on the shores of Crete. But tonight you will learn who she was before any of that, before the bronze giant and the evil eye and the ichor running like molten lead, before the myth turned her into a monster. She was a priestess, a princess, a granddaughter of the sun, and she was the person who actually accomplished everything that Jason is credited with. Every task, every challenge, every impossible feat. She did it, or someone else did it, and Jason stood nearby and accepted the credit. That is the impossibility at the heart of this story. Not a monster, not a magic fleece. The impossibility is the hero himself, a protagonist who does nothing. A man at the center of the greatest adventure in Greek mythology who earns none of it. The myth knows this. It was designed, from its earliest versions, to punish him for it. But first, the ship. The Argo was designed by a goddess. That fact gets buried under the drama of the quest and the fame of the crew, but it is the structural foundation of the entire story. Athena, goddess of wisdom, warfare, strategic intelligence, and craft, personally supervised the construction. Not from a distance, not through intermediaries or dreams. She came to the shipyard. She stood among the timber and the pitch and the wood shavings and told the builder, a man named Argus, exactly how to shape the hull. Apollonius of Rhodes confirms this. So does Apollodorus. So does Diodorus Siculus. Three independent sources across several centuries, all agreeing Athena designed the Argo. The tradition is old and stable, a goddess of intelligence engineering a ship. Not Poseidon, god of the sea. Poseidon wanted nothing to do with the Argo and was frequently hostile to its mission. Not Hermes, god of travelers. The smartest mind in the Greek pantheon, designing a vessel for a specific strategic purpose, carry 50 men through waters that had never been navigated to a kingdom at the edge of the known world. And bring them home. Pindar calls the Argo the first longship, the first vessel designed for sustained open water voyaging rather than coastal hopping. Whether that preserves a genuine memory of Bronze Age naval innovation is debated. But the mythological claim is unambiguous. Before the Argo, ships stayed close to shore. After the Argo, ships crossed seas. She was a proof of concept, a first-of-class vessel. And every warship and merchant ship that followed her was, in some structural sense, her descendant. 50 oars, 25 per side. Each rower a demigod or a hero with his own myth, his own lineage, his own claim to being the best at something. Think about that crew roster for a moment. 50 seats, 50 extraordinary men, each one accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. And they all agreed to sit in a row and pull sticks through salt water at the command of a man who was not the strongest, not the wisest, not the best fighter, not the best sailor. Not the best anything. The ship was approximately 92 feet long and 13 feet wide at the beam. Pine hull, oak structural members, ash oars. The hull was sealed with pine pitch. Black, acrid, slightly sweet, the smell that clung to every shipwright in the ancient Mediterranean. The construction technique was mortise and tenon, precisely carved rectangular slots in the edge of each plank, joined by snug wooden pegs, each locked with a pin drilled through plank. And tenon simultaneously. The result was a hull of extraordinary integrity, stress distributed across the entire surface rather than concentrated at nail points. When you ran a hand along the inside, you felt not individual planks, but a continuous surface, as if the ship had been carved from a single piece of wood. And in the bow, where the prow beam met the keel, the plank of Dodona oak, the voice of Zeus trapped in timber. Did it speak when Argus fitted it into place? Did it offer an opinion on the angle of the keel or the quality of the pitch? We do not know. I like to think the builder heard it first. That the wood spoke to the hands that shaped it, the way good materials sometimes seem to. Grain suggesting where to cut, weight suggesting where to place, the texture of a thing telling you, if you are paying attention, what it wants to become. The greatest ship ever built. Designed by a goddess, carrying a voice of a god, built for a man who would never deserve either. Remember the beam of Dodona with its trapped voice. Because at the very end of this story, that beam will do something I did not expect when I first read the sources. Something that reframed this entire myth for me. We will get there. But first, the man the ship was built for. Because to understand why the greatest vessel in history ended up on a beach in the dark rotting, you have to understand who was standing at the helm. To understand why the Argo was built, you need to understand the man it was built for. And to understand that man, you need to start with a crime committed against him before he could walk. Jason was born a prince. His father, Aeson, was the rightful king of Iolcus, a city in Thessaly in the north of Greece. Iolcus sat at the head of the Pagasetic Gulf. Sheltered water, roughly 37 miles of calm sailing from the open Aegean, good timber on the surrounding hills, an excellent location for a port city in the late Bronze Age. Aeson ruled it, by most accounts, competently and without particular distinction. His half-brother Peleus was a different kind of man. Peleus seized the throne. The sources disagree on the method. Sudden coup or slow political suffocation, but they agree on the result. Peleus ruled. Aeson was imprisoned or exiled or simply erased from relevance, stripped of power but kept alive in that specifically cruel way that usurpers sometimes prefer. Because killing the old king creates a martyr and merely ignoring him creates nothing at all. And the infant Jason, the legitimate heir, was smuggled out of the city before Peleus could decide what to do with him. He was sent to Mount Pelion, to the centaur Chiron. If you know Greek mythology at all, you know Chiron, the one civilized centaur. The rest of his kind were violent, drunken, and unreliable. Given to wine and rage and the kind of chaotic, destructive behavior that made centaurs a menace to every community unfortunate enough to live near them. Chiron was different, patient, wise, learned. He lived in a cave on the slopes of Pelion that the later sources describe as something between a school and a monastery. A place of order and study and intentional living, where the walls were hung with dried herbs and the shelves held jars of medicinal compounds, and the air smelled of wood smoke and thyme, and the particular musty sweetness of a space that has been inhabited by a scholar for a very long time. He taught medicine, not battlefield first aid, actual medicine. The identification of healing plants, the preparation of poultices and tinctures, the setting of broken bones, the treatment of fevers, the management of wounds that had become infected. He taught music, the lyre, the voice, the mathematical relationships between notes that the Greeks would later formalize as the foundations of Western harmony. He taught hunting. Not as sport, but as survival skill, reading animal tracks, understanding the patterns of prey movement, the patience required to wait in perfect stillness for an hour while a deer moved into range. He taught astronomy. The names and movements of stars, the way constellations shifted with the seasons. The navigational applications of celestial observation that would prove critical on a ship sailing through waters where no landmarks existed. His students included Achilles, who would become the deadliest warrior in history, Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine. And now Jason, which, if you think about it, is an extraordinary thing. The two most famous graduates of Chiron's school became a god and the greatest warrior who ever lived. The third became a man whose primary skill was standing nearby while other people accomplished things. The mountain school of a centaur was the closest thing the Greek world had to an elite academy. A place where children were transformed into the kind of adults who might survive what the gods had planned for them. Jason grew up on Pelion for roughly 20 years. Not a metaphor, not an approximation, 20 years on a mountain. More than 6,000 days of training that left him fluent in the language of the wild in a way that no city-raised warrior could replicate. He learned to hunt and fight and read weather, and set broken bones and identify plants by their leaves in the dark. He learned to run on mountain terrain, to swim in cold rivers, to lie on stone, to go hungry without complaint. He learned the names of every herb that grew on Pelion. Which ones healed, which ones poisoned, which ones could be eaten raw, and which ones had to be cooked. He learned who his father was, what had been stolen, what Peleus had done. And when he reached manhood, he walked down the mountain to Iolcus to take back his kingdom. He arrived wearing one sandal. This matters enormously because Peleus had received an oracle. The oracle at Delphi, the highest prophetic authority in the Greek world, had warned him to beware of a man wearing one sandal. A monosandalos, someone who arrives incomplete, asymmetric, 1 foot bare on the stone, 1 foot shod, a figure belonging fully to neither the wild mountain nor the civilized city. How Jason lost the sandal is a story in itself. He was crossing the river Anoris, coming down from Pelion. The Anoris is a seasonal river. Dry, or nearly dry in summer, but in the spring, when the snow melts on Pelion's upper slopes, it fills fast, running cold and brown with mountain sediment. Strong enough to push a man off his feet if he is not careful about his footing. Jason reached the ford and found an old woman at the water's edge. Bent, frail, unable to cross alone, she asked for help. He could have walked past. The river was dangerous. The woman was a stranger. He was on his way to confront a usurper and reclaim a kingdom, and stopping to carry an elderly woman through a flooded river was not, strictly speaking, part of the plan. But he stopped. He lifted her onto his back. He carried her across, and in the crossing, the mud sucking at his feet, the current pushing against his legs, the weight of the woman pressing down on his shoulders. One sandal was torn from his foot. The river took it. He reached the far bank barefoot on one side, and the old woman revealed herself as Hera, queen of the gods, who had been testing the young men of Thessaly to see which one would stop for a stranger in need. Jason passed. Hera became his patron, her support. Invisible but relentless, operating behind the scenes in ways that Jason himself often did not recognize, would shape everything that followed. There is something about this detail that I find hard to let go of. The one act of genuine goodness in Jason's entire story happens before the story begins. He helps an old woman cross a river. He does it without knowing who she is or what he will gain. It is selfless. It is kind. And it is the last unambiguously good thing he will ever do. Everything after every decision, every triumph, every clever negotiation, is built on the labor of others. The kindness at the river is real. The heroism that follows is borrowed. Peleus saw the single sandal. He recognized the oracle walking toward him in human form. He could not kill Jason publicly. The prince had arrived in daylight. The people of Iolcus recognized Aeson's son, and the crowd's enthusiasm made assassination politically impossible. So Peleus did something more elegant. He offered a quest. "Bring me the Golden Fleece," he said, "the fleece of the divine ram that hangs in a sacred grove in Colchis, at the far eastern shore of the Black Sea. Bring it back to Iolcus, and the throne is yours. The Golden Fleece, the skin of a winged ram sent by the gods to rescue two children, Phrixus and Helle, from a sacrificial plot." The ram flew east, carrying them over the sea. Helle fell from its back into the strait between Europe and Asia, which was afterward called the Hellespont, the Sea of Helle. Phrixus survived, reached Colchis, sacrificed the ram, and hung the Golden Fleece in a grove sacred to Ares, guarded by a dragon that never slept. Peleus was not offering a quest. He was offering a death sentence dressed in the formal language of heroic opportunity. Consider the logistics. Colchis sat at the far eastern end of the Black Sea. Modern Georgia, at the foot of the Caucasus Mountains, a place so remote from the Greek heartland that reliable information about it was scarce. To reach it, Jason would have to sail northeast through the Aegean, thread the narrow strait of the Hellespont, cross the Sea of Marmara, navigate the Bosphorus, a current-swept bottleneck where the Black Sea funnels into the Mediterranean, and then cross the full width of the Black Sea itself, a body of water the Greeks considered hostile and unpredictable, and which most sailors avoided entirely. A journey of months through waters no Greek ship had successfully navigated as a complete route, and at the end of it, the fleece was guarded by an immortal dragon in a grove sacred to the god of war. In the kingdom of a man, Aeetes, son of the sun god Helios, who possessed among other assets a pair of fire-breathing bronze bulls forged by Hephaestus himself. No one had stolen the fleece. No one had seriously tried. The mission was designed to fail. Peleus expected Jason to die far from home, and the problem of the one-sandaled heir would resolve itself in the belly of a dragon or the depths of an alien sea. Jason accepted immediately. No hesitation, no negotiation, no request for time or resources or guarantees. The sources present this as heroic confidence. The fearlessness of a young man raised by the best teacher in the world, trained to face any challenge. It may also have been the only available move. Refuse and be branded a coward unworthy of the throne he claimed. Accept and at least have a story, even if the story ends with his bones on a foreign shore. But then Jason did something Peleus had not anticipated. He did not go alone. He sent out a call across Greece, to every kingdom, every coastal city, every mountain camp where a man with a reputation and a weapon might be found. Come with me to Colchis. Come sail to the edge of the world on a ship built by Athena. Come win glory that will outlive your bones. And they came. From islands and mainland cities and harbor towns and inland strongholds. They came because the quest was impossible, and impossible quests are the only kind that attract the best people. They came because Heracles was coming, and proximity to Heracles was the surest path to immortality. They came because they were young, and young men believe they cannot die, and the quest offered the one thing that young men who believe they cannot die want more than safety: proof. Proof that they are as extraordinary as they suspect. Proof that they belong to the generation that will be remembered. 50 of them. I want to stay with this number because it is not decorative. Each of the 50 had a name, a father, often divine, a specific skill, a full mythology of his own. The catalogue of the Argonauts is one of the great roll calls in Western literature, and it tells you something about the ambition the Greeks invested in this particular story. Start with the ones you know. Heracles, son of Zeus, the strongest human being who had ever lived or would ever live. By the time he joined the Argo, he had already killed the Nemean lion, the Hydra, and the Erymanthian boar. His presence was both an asset and a structural problem. An asset because no crew that included Heracles could be considered vulnerable. A problem because the mere existence of a man who could hold up the sky made everyone else feel slightly redundant. He brought his companion Hylas, a young man of great beauty whom Heracles loved. That detail matters because of how Heracles leaves the expedition. We will get to it. But remember Hylas. Remember that the strongest man in the world had a vulnerability, and it was not a physical weakness. It was love. Orpheus. Son of Apollo, or in some traditions the son of a Thracian king and the muse Calliope, the greatest musician who had ever lived. His music moved stones. That is literal. When Orpheus played the lyre, rocks shifted on the ground, trees uprooted themselves and walked toward the sound, rivers changed course, animals lay down together and were still. His music operated on the physical world like gravity, a force, not a suggestion. He was recruited as a specific countermeasure against the sirens, the creatures whose song killed sailors. The Argonauts needed a musician who could overpower the most dangerous sound in the world. They brought the only one who could, Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, the divine twins. Same mother Leda, different fathers. Castor was mortal, son of King Tyndareus. Pollux was immortal, son of Zeus, one who could die, one who could not. Castor was the finest horseman in Greece. Pollux the finest boxer. After the Argo, when Castor was killed in battle, Pollux begged Zeus to let him share his immortality. Zeus agreed. They alternate one day alive, one day dead, trading existence for eternity. They were placed in the sky as Gemini. You can see them tonight if the sky is clear. 2 stars side by side. Atalanta in some versions, not all. The inclusion is debated, and the debate itself is interesting because of what it reveals about the limits of Greek storytelling. The fastest runner in Greece. A woman, the only woman among 50 heroes, if she was there at all. Raised by bears in the wilderness of Arcadia after her father abandoned her at birth for the crime of not being a son. She could outrun any man alive. She could outhunt any man alive. She had killed 2 centaurs who tried to assault her. Killed them, not escaped them, not been rescued from them. She drew first blood on the Caledonian boar, the most dangerous animal in Greek mythology, while the male heroes around her hesitated. The versions of the Argonaut catalogue that include Atalanta treat her presence as unremarkable. She was the fastest. The ship needed speed. Gender was not a criterion for the roster. The versions that exclude her do so not because she was unqualified. No one disputes her qualifications. But because the social implications of a woman living in close quarters with 50 men on a ship with no privacy made certain poets uncomfortable, the discomfort is theirs. The qualification was hers. Then the ones you probably do not know, who shaped the voyage more than the famous names. Tiphys, the helmsman, the man who actually steered the ship. You could make a serious argument that Tiphys was the most important person aboard. Heroes can fight. Heroes can sing. None of it matters if the ship runs aground because no one can read a current. Tiphys understood the relationship between wind and coastal geography. He could feel a change in the current through the hull before it showed on the surface. He died during the voyage. Illness, not combat, and his death was, by some accounts, the crew's greatest loss. Because another strong man could replace Heracles, no one could replace Tiphys, Peleus, father of Achilles. That single fact, father of Achilles, tends to swallow everything else about the man, but before Achilles was born, before Troy, before the wrath and the grief and the funeral pyres, Peleus was a young warrior who signed up for a voyage to the end of the world because it sounded like something worth doing. He was not the strongest on the ship. He was not the wisest. He was solid, dependable, the kind of man who pulls his oar without complaint and does not need to be told twice. When the greatest warrior in Greek history was born years later, his father had already sailed to the edge of the known world, and back, and the son's entire war. The Trojan War, the defining conflict of Greek mythology, was fought by men whose fathers had been Argonauts. The crew of the Argo was the parent generation of the Iliad. Troy was the sequel. Lynceus, who could see through solid objects, his vision was so acute that, according to the sources, he could see through the earth itself. Could spot underground water, could identify metals buried in rock, could watch the roots of trees growing in soil, a human radar system, a living ground-penetrating instrument. On a voyage into unknown waters, a man who could see what lay beneath the surface, literal or otherwise, was worth more than another sword. Zetes and Calais, sons of Boreas, the north wind. They had wings, actual wings growing from their shoulders or ankles, depending on the source. They could fly. Not glide, not jump long distances, fly. Sustained, powered flight, as natural to them as running was to Atalanta. They used this ability to chase the harpies across the sky. Pursuing wind spirits through the air over the Aegean, blades drawn, the sons of the north wind hunting creatures of the air on their father's terms. The image is so vivid, so kinetic, so visually specific that it reads like something designed by a modern visual effects team. It was composed by oral poets roughly 3,000 years ago, and it has lost none of its power. 50 heroes, one ship, 92 feet of pine and oak, 13 feet wide at the beam. Roughly the footprint of a city bus, if the bus had no roof, no seats, no engine, and was being actively attacked by the sea. The benches were close enough that your knees nearly touched the back of the man in front of you. The oar handles, when 50 men pulled at once, made the whole hull vibrate. A low thrumming you could feel through the soles of your feet, through the seat of your bench, through the bones of your pelvis. The smell was pine pitch and salt, and the particular sourness of men who had not been dry in days. They argued constantly, they competed. They second-guessed Jason's decisions and questioned his authority and nearly came to blows over who sat where and who pulled which oar. What does it actually take to lead 50 people who are all individually better than you? Not charisma. Heracles had more of that. Not strength. Heracles had all of that. Not intelligence. Orpheus, Lynceus, Tiphys. Not combat skill. Castor, Pollux, Atalanta. The question is serious. By what logic does Jason remain in command of this ship for the entire voyage? What quality keeps 50 demigods pulling oars in the direction one ordinary man points? And Jason managed them, not through brilliance or divine power or superhuman capability, through patience, through stubbornness, through the quiet, unglamorous skill of listening to people smarter than himself and asking help from people stronger than himself. He was the project manager in a ship full of superstars. The voyage succeeded not because he was extraordinary, but because he was adequate. And because adequacy, in a leader surrounded by excellence, is sometimes exactly what is needed. I keep returning to this detail. Think about it. The most successful captain on the Argo was the one who knew he was not the best at anything. The hero who did nothing, surrounded by men who could do everything. There is something in that observation I find uncomfortable to sit with for too long. But here's what the crew list does not tell you. One person is missing from the roster. Not an Argonaut, someone waiting at the destination. Someone whose name every member of the crew will learn, and none of them will forget, and most of them will come to fear. We are not ready for her yet. But she is already there, in Colchis, in a temple at the edge of the world, grinding herbs by torchlight, and the voyage itself is about to teach this crew its first lesson. A lesson that has nothing to do with monsters or kings or impossible tasks. A lesson about the one thing that can stop 50 heroes dead in their tracks before they even clear the Aegean. The Argo launched from Pegasae on a morning that Apollonius describes as bright and windless. 50 oars entered the water. The hull moved forward. The crowd on the shore. Mothers, wives, children, old men who had been heroes once, watched the dark prow shrink against the sea. Most of them stood in silence. Because the silence of watching someone leave for a place from which they may not return is one of the oldest silences in human experience, and nothing fills it. Chiron was there. The centaur came down from Pelion to the waterline, an extraordinary gesture for a being who rarely left the mountain. His wife Chariclo stood beside him, holding the infant Achilles. Chiron lifted the baby's hand and waved it at the departing ship. Peleus was aboard, pulling an oar, heading for a horizon he could not see past, and on the shore, his son. The boy who would burn the towers of Troy waved goodbye in the arms of a centaur, too young to understand what a wave means or what a father is or why the dark shape on the water was getting smaller. Apollonius includes this detail. A lesser writer would cut to the adventure. Apollonius shows you a baby waving at a ship. He reminds you that every hero on that vessel was someone's child. The adventure has not started, and already the story is about loss. I want you to understand what the voyage felt like. Not the mythology of it, but the physical reality. 50 men in an open boat, no cabin, no shelter from sun or rain or spray. The rowers sat on wooden benches roughly 3 feet apart, each facing the stern, each pulling an oar approximately 15 feet long, 25 strokes per minute at cruising speed. 11 pounds of force per stroke, 275 pounds of force per minute per man, sustained for hours. Modern testing suggests a trained galley rower could maintain that output for about 3 to 4 hours before collapse. The Argonauts rowed for days. Mediterranean summer sun on an open boat, reflected off the water from below, absorbed by the dark pitch from all sides. The heat settled on the shoulders first, then the back of the neck, then the tops of the thighs. A weight as real as the oar in your hands. No shade. The salt spray dried on skin and turned it raw over days. Blisters on the palms bled before calluses formed, and the oar handles grew slick and then sticky and then rough with the residue of broken skin and the smell. 50 men sweating, living in the clothes they rode in, with no plumbing beyond a bucket of seawater hauled over the gunwale, pine pitch, salt, bilge water sloshing below the floorboards. Stale bread, olives turning soft, wine diluted with seawater when the fresh water ran out, which happened faster than anyone planned for. The reality beneath the myth. Hold on to this image, the heat, the blisters, the smell, because when the myth later gives you divine interventions and impossible feats, I want you to remember the bodies underneath them. The Argo was divine engineering. She was also a cramped, stinking wooden tube full of exhausted men pulling sticks through salt water. The heroes of Greek mythology lived in their bodies, and their bodies suffered, and the suffering was part of the story, whether the poets acknowledged it or not. The first stop was Lemnos. Lemnos is a real island in the northern Aegean, about 90 miles northeast of the mainland, roughly 2 days of hard rowing from Pegasae in good conditions. When the Argonauts arrived, they found it occupied entirely by women. The men were all dead, killed by the women themselves. The story, the women of Lemnos had offended Aphrodite, who cursed them with an unbearable stench. Their husbands took Thracian concubines. The women killed every man on the island. Husbands, fathers, sons, all of them, and when the Argo arrived, they had been alone long enough that the question of how to sustain their society had become urgent. The Argonauts stayed. Much longer than they should have. The queen, Hypsipyle, took Jason as a lover. The other women paired with other heroes. Days became weeks. Some versions of the tradition say they remained on Lemnos for an entire season, perhaps 4 months, while the quest rotted in the harbor. The quest stalled. The Argo sat in the harbor collecting weed on its hull, its oars unshipped, its crew entirely distracted. Heracles broke the spell. He had stayed aboard the ship the entire time, refusing to go ashore, sitting alone on the deck while his companions climbed the hill to the city. Finally, he shamed them. He asked, with the blunt, graceless directness that was his specific gift, whether they had sailed to the edge of the world to chase glory, or to chase women in the Aegean. The crew returned to the ship. They sailed, the very first stop on the voyage, and the greatest danger was not a monster or a storm or a hostile king. It was comfort. The temptation to stop moving, to settle into warmth and companionship, to trade the terrible uncertainty of the quest for the quiet certainty of a welcoming bed. The Argo's first lesson: the things that stop you are not always the things that attack you. Sometimes they are the things that hold you gently and ask you to stay. A warm bed. A voice that knows your name. The weight of an arm across your chest in the dark. After Lemnos, the stops came faster, and the lessons grew darker. The Doliones lived on the southern coast of the Propontis, the Sea of Marmara, near the city that bore the name of their young king, Cyzicus. He was newly married, generous. He welcomed the Argonauts with food, and wine and shelter, and the kind of open-hearted hospitality that the Greek world considered sacred. Ischenia, the bond between host and guest, protected by Zeus himself, the Argonauts feasted, they rested, they sailed the next morning with full stomachs and favorable memories. Then the wind turned. In the night, a storm blew the Argo back to the same coast. The crew came ashore in darkness, exhausted, disoriented, unable to see the landmarks that would have told them where they were. And the Doliones, hearing armed men landing on their beach in the dead of night, assumed they were pirates. They attacked. The Argonauts fought back. In the chaos and the blackness and the confusion of combat, where neither side could see clearly enough to identify the other, the Argonauts killed Cyzicus, their host. The man who had fed them and sheltered them hours before. Jason himself, in some versions, delivered the fatal blow. Morning revealed what darkness had hidden. The Argonauts saw the bodies of their hosts scattered on the beach. They recognized Cyzicus. His young wife, Cleite, hanged herself from grief when she learned her husband was dead. The crew mourned for 3 days, and here is something no other version of this story dwells on: 3 days of ritual lamentation. Of funeral rites performed by the very men whose hands had done the killing. Not all violence in myth comes from malice or malice's cousin, ambition. Some of it comes from the dark and the wind and the terrible inability to recognize a friend at night. The Argo sailed on carrying that weight, the knowledge that good intentions and sacred bonds meant nothing when the visibility dropped to 0. And notice who is absent from this passage: Jason, the captain, the leader. Where was he when his crew killed their hosts? The sources are unclear. The hero who did nothing. Did nothing here either, and the nothing cost a king his life. The impossible gap between what the myth claims Jason is and what the myth shows Jason doing widens with every chapter. Then Mysia. And Hylas. The Argo put ashore on the coast of Mysia for water. The water casks were nearly empty. An ongoing logistical problem on a ship carrying 50 men through summer heat. Someone had to go inland to find a spring. Hylas volunteered, young, eager, wanting to be useful to a crew that mostly tolerated him as Heracles' companion, rather than valuing him on his own merits. He took a bronze jug and walked into the forest. The spring was in a clearing. moonlight on the water, or so Apollonius describes it. A pool fed by a spring, clear and cold, surrounded by the kind of lush vegetation that grows where water meets warm air. The nymphs of the spring. Water spirits, divine beings bound to their particular body of water, saw Hylas kneeling at the pool's edge. They saw his reflection in the water. They were enchanted by his beauty, and they pulled him under. He vanished. Not drowned, taken. Absorbed into the water itself, into the world of the nymphs, into a space between the mortal world and the divine that had no exit. There was no body, no blood, no sound. Just a bronze jug left at the pool's edge, and the faint ripples of a disturbance that was already settling back to stillness by the time anyone thought to look. Heracles went into the forest after him. He searched for hours, crashing through the underbrush, snapping branches that a lesser man could not have bent, calling Hylas's name in a voice that carried for miles through the trees. He searched all night. The next day he searched again. He tore up trees by their roots, literally uprooted full-grown pines, in case the spring was hidden beneath them. He threatened the forest itself, as though violence directed at the landscape could force the nymphs to return what they had taken. How do you navigate a ship when the strongest member of your crew is crashing through a forest half a mile inland, tearing up trees by their roots? Calling a name that no one will answer? How do you make the calculation? The cold, necessary, irreversible calculation that a person lost is truly lost and that the mission must continue without them? The Argo could not wait. The wind was turning. Tiphys needed to catch the current or they would lose days, maybe weeks. The crew debated. Some argued they could not leave without Heracles, that sailing without the strongest man in Greece was strategic suicide. Others pointed out that Heracles was not coming back, that the forest had swallowed him as surely as the spring had swallowed Hylas. Jason made the decision. They would sail without him. The strongest man in Greece, left behind in the forests of Mysia, calling the name of someone who would never answer. The man who had killed the Hydra and wrestled death to a standstill, reduced to a figure crashing through trees in the dark, his voice breaking. His strength completely useless against the one enemy it could not defeat, absence. He loved a person more than he loved the quest, more than glory, more than the crew or the mission or the fleece or any of the things that heroes are supposed to value above all else. The Argo sailed on, and the most powerful warrior in the Greek world stayed behind on a foreign shore, looking for a boy in a spring. That is not a minor detail. That is not a subplot. That is the myth telling you what the voyage costs. It costs everyone. And what it takes from you is never the thing you prepared to lose, it is always the other thing, the thing you were holding so close you forgot it could be taken. That night, the Argo sailed without Heracles. The wind had shifted, a cold current off the Mysian coast, pushing them northeast toward the Bosphorus. The oars were shipped. The sail was set, and the crew sat in silence on their benches, staring at the dark water, unwilling to look at the empty bench where Heracles had sat. It was in the middle watch. Well past midnight, the stars turning slowly above the mast, that the beam spoke. The prow of the ship made a sound. Not the creak of wood against water, not the groan of the hull flexing in the swell. Something else, a vibration that ran through the Dodona timber and emerged as a voice. Low, toneless, the kind of sound you hear with the bones of your face rather than your ears. The beam at the prow was speaking, and what it said, according to Apollonius, was a warning. The route you have chosen leads through grief. The cost of what you have already done has not yet been paid. Turn back, and you lose the quest. Continue, and you lose more than the quest has ever been worth. The crew heard it. All of them. Peleus at his bench, Castor and Pollux in the stern, Orpheus with his lyre resting silent in his lap. They heard the ship itself counsel against the voyage, and they sat in the dark and said nothing. Because what do you say when the vessel you are sitting in tells you to stop? When the wood beneath your feet has an opinion about where you are going, and the opinion is that you should not go? Jason did not respond. He sat at the stern, looking east, and waited for the beam to finish. And when the voice faded, when the Dodona timber settled back into the ordinary creaking of a ship at sea, he gave the order to maintain course. He had been told the price. He chose to pay it, or rather, he chose to let other people pay it for him, which is the same choice he made at every turning point of the voyage, and which is the reason the myth ends the way it does. The beam did not speak again that night, but the crew knew, from that moment on, that they were sailing inside something that was more than a ship. They were riding in a thing that knew the future and disapproved of it, and they kept rowing anyway, because the alternative, climbing ashore in the dark on a foreign coast, with Heracles howling in the trees behind them, was worse than anything the beam could say. There was a blind prophet ahead of them. A man who knew the future in its entirety, who had been punished for knowing too much, who was going to tell them the one thing they were not prepared to hear. He did not know they were coming, but he had been waiting for them for years. The Argo sailed northeast, through the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, where the current runs fast and unpredictable, where the wind funnels between the hills and changes direction without warning, into the Propontis, the Sea of Marmara, and then toward the Bosphorus, the final strait, the passage into the Black Sea. But first, a stop on the Thracian coast, a blind prophet in a house full of rotten food. Phineus was a king and a seer. He had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo, the ability to see the future with absolute clarity. But Zeus, furious that Phineus had revealed too much of the gods' plans to mortals, punished him. The punishment was specific and terrible. Zeus sent the Harpies, bird women with the faces of pale, starving girls and the wings and talons of vultures. Every time Phineus sat down to eat, the Harpies descended. They seized the food from his hands and his table. What they did not take, they fouled, defecating on the remaining scraps, smearing everything with a stench that made the food inedible. Phineus was starving. Not dying, because the gods kept him alive. They wanted the punishment to continue, but wasting, his body consuming itself, his prophetic sight functioning perfectly while his physical body failed. The Argonauts found him skeletal, skin drawn tight over bone, eyes vacant, not from blindness, but from the particular vacancy of a man who has resigned himself to suffering without end. The house smelled of decay. Not the sharp decay of something freshly ruined, but the stale, sweet, layered rot of food that had been fouled and left and fouled again, week after week, until the walls themselves had absorbed it. The table was still set, the plates were still there, crusted with whatever the Harpies had left behind. A king's table, in a king's house, and the smell of it would have turned your stomach from the doorway. Think about what that means. A man who can see every future, every triumph, every disaster, every choice that will ever matter. But who cannot eat a piece of bread without it being torn from his hands. All the knowledge in the world, and he is starving. Zetes and Calais, the winged sons of the north wind. This was their moment. They drew their swords and waited. When the Harpies came, swooping through the open windows, shrieking, reaching for the food that the Argonauts had laid out as bait. The twins launched themselves into the air, wings against wings, blades against talons. They chased the Harpies south across the Aegean higher and faster, until the goddess Iris appeared and commanded them to stop. The Harpies would not return. Phineus was free. In gratitude, the blind prophet gave them what they needed most: information. He told them the route through the Bosphorus. He told them what lay beyond. And he told them about the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, two massive stone formations at the entrance to the Black Sea, and they moved. They were not fixed geological features. They were alive or animated or enchanted. The sources are not entirely clear on the mechanism, only on the effect. When a ship entered the strait between them, the rocks crashed together with enough force to pulverize timber and bone. No ship had ever passed through. The passage was, in the most literal sense, impossible. The narrow channel was littered with wreckage. Splintered hulls, shattered oars, fragments of masts reduced to kindling by the impact of stone on stone. The rocks moved fast. The gap between them was brief. The sound, according to the traditions, was a grinding, low subsonic felt in the sternum more than heard with the ears. The kind of sound that makes your body want to flee before your mind has processed what it is hearing. Phineas told them the trick. Send a dove through first. Watch the timing. If the dove makes it through, follow immediately. The instant, the rocks begin to rebound from their collision, before they can build momentum for the next strike. The gap will be narrow. Seconds. The timing must be exact. Row as though your life depends on it, because it does. And one more thing, Phineas said. Pray to Athena. Because at the moment when the rocks are closing, and the oars are straining and the hull is halfway through the gap, the only thing that will save you is the judgment of the goddess who designed your ship. She knows the hull, she knows its tolerances, she knows to the centimeter how much clearance the Argo needs. The Argonauts sent the dove, a white dove. The sources specify the color because in the context of dark rock and dark water and the spray thrown up by colliding stone, the whiteness of the bird was the only way to track it. The dove flew into the gap. The rocks began to close. The grinding sound started, deep, subsonic, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth and your sternum before your ears fully register it. The rocks slammed shut. The dove emerged on the far side. Alive, flying, missing only its tail feathers. The tips of the longest feathers, clipped by stone moving at the speed of a falling building. Close enough. Barely. But enough. Tiphys screamed the command. This was his moment. The helmsman, the navigator, the man who understood the relationship between a ship and the water it moved through better than anyone alive. 50 oars hit the water simultaneously. The Argo surged forward into the strait. The rocks were rebounding, separating, the gap opening. A window measured in seconds, a space measured in feet. The rowers pulled with everything they had. Not the measured, sustainable rhythm of cruising speed, the desperate, muscle-tearing, oar-bending, all-out sprint of men rowing for their lives. 25 oars per side, each one bending under the force of a hero's full strength. The water churned white behind the stern, the spray from the colliding rocks. Seawater forced upward by the impact of thousands of tons of stone, rained down on the deck, salt water in the eyes, in the mouth, on the hands gripping the oars. The sound was enormous and getting louder, stone grinding against stone, the deep geological protest of two formations being wrenched apart by whatever enchantment held them. And beginning already to close again. Athena pushed. The sources are clear on this. Athena herself placed her hand against the stern of the ship and shoved. The divine engineer, lending her own strength to the vessel she had designed, adding the force of a goddess to the force of 50 rowing heroes in the instant when the gap was narrowing. And the margin was measured in inches. The Argo shot through. The rocks caught the stern. The very last section of the hull, the curved timber of the stern post, and sheared off the stern ornament, a decorative piece. Nothing structural, but that close. The width of a hand, the thickness of a plank, the distance between survival and obliteration measured in the same units a carpenter uses to mark a cut. And then the rocks stopped moving. According to the myth, once a ship successfully passed through the Symplegades, the enchantment broke, the rocks rooted to the ocean floor. They became fixed, permanent, ordinary geological features. The same rocks you can see today at the northern entrance to the Bosphorus, standing in the strait like gateposts for a gate that no longer closes, they never moved again. The Argo did not merely survive the Symplegades, she ended them. She turned an impossible barrier into ordinary geography. She made the Black Sea accessible. Not just for herself, but for every ship that would follow. The passage was open. The gate was broken. The age of exploration beyond the Aegean had begun, and it had begun because a ship designed by a goddess, steered by the best helmsman in the world, rowed by 50 heroes pulling at the absolute limit of human endurance, had been 2 inches faster than a pair of enchanted rocks. That is the Argo's second great lesson after Lemnos. The first lesson was that comfort can stop you as surely as danger. The second is that some barriers can only be passed once. That some gates close behind you, that the act of passing through changes both you and the passage, and neither will ever be the same. Phineas had given them one more piece of information. He told them what they would find on the far side of the Black Sea. He told them about Colchis, about King Aeetes and his fire-breathing bulls and his dragon that never slept. And he told them, quietly, carefully, as though the information itself was dangerous, that they would not succeed by strength alone. That the key to the Golden Fleece was not a warrior, it was a woman. He did not say her name. The Black Sea opened before them. The Greeks called it the Euxine, the hospitable sea, which was a lie, an ancient euphemism. You give a dangerous thing a pleasant name to keep it from hearing you disrespect it. The Euxine was cold, deep, and alien. Unlike the Aegean, where you could see the next island from the last one, where the water was shallow and warm and blue and full of familiar fish, the Black Sea was dark, almost lightless at depth. Below about 500 feet, the water was anoxic, devoid of dissolved oxygen, saturated with hydrogen sulfide. Nothing lived down there. The deep water of the Black Sea is, in a chemical sense, dead. It has been dead for approximately 7,000 years, 5,000 years before Jason was born. Since rising sea levels after the last ice age flooded what had been a freshwater lake and created a permanent boundary between the oxygen-rich surface layer and the anoxic deep. The Argonauts did not know the chemistry, but they knew the water was wrong. Fishermen who dragged nets too deep pulled up nothing. The water smelled different. Faintly sulfurous, especially after storms churned up the lower layers. The color was wrong. The behavior was wrong. It was colder than it should have been, darker than it should have been, and the coastlines were populated by people the Greeks did not recognize. Thracians, Paphlagonians, Colchians, peoples who spoke languages that sounded like gravel being poured into metal bowls. This was the edge. Beyond the Euxine, the maps ended. Night on the Black Sea. The Argo moving east under oar, the sail furled because the wind has died, 50 men pulling in rhythm against flat, black water. They have been at sea for somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks since leaving the Bosphorus. Modern estimates based on realistic rowing speeds of 2.5 to 4 miles per hour suggest the crossing of the Black Sea alone took at minimum 12 days of sustained effort. No moon or the thinnest crescent. Stars, more stars than you have ever seen in a modern sky, because there is no light pollution for 1,000 years in any direction. The Milky Way like a wound across the darkness. The water beneath the hull is black, and beneath the black is the anoxic layer, 600 feet of dead water that has not moved or mixed or breathed since before the pyramids were built. And above the water, the air is still. No wind, no sound except the oars and the breathing of the crew, and the occasional creak of the hull flexing against the swell. 3 in the morning on the Euxine, the time of night when the body wants to shut down and the mind starts offering reasons to stop. The rower on the bench in front of you has been pulling for 2 hours and his shoulders are shaking. Your own hands have stopped hurting. The blisters broke hours ago, and what remains is a numbness that is almost worse, because you cannot feel the oar properly, and your grip has to be conscious now, deliberate. Every stroke a decision your fingers would rather not make. The bench beneath you is worn smooth and warm from your body heat. The man behind you missed a stroke, and his oar dragged and threw off your rhythm, and you said something sharp, and he said something sharper, and now neither of you is speaking. The water is black. And the sky is black, and the only light is the stars, and they offer no comfort, because they are very far away and very cold, and they do not care whether 50 men in a wooden boat reach the far shore or sink without a trace into the dead water below. This is what it meant to sail to Colchis, not the adventure of it, the endurance of it. The days and days and days of monotonous, grinding physical labor in an environment of increasing strangeness, moving further from everything familiar, toward a destination that every piece of available intelligence suggested was a trap. I want to bring you back, for a moment, to the replica crew and the 90-minute threshold. That was the number the modern experiment gave us, 90 minutes before trained, healthy rowers in a purpose-built replica hit their physical limit. Jason's crew has been rowing for weeks now, through the Hellespont, across the Marmara, through the Bosphorus, and now east across the Black Sea. Not 90 minutes, not 9 hours, weeks. The gap between what the 2008 replica crew could sustain and what the myth simply takes for granted. 50 men rowing through the dead water of the Euxine for days on end, maintaining enough speed and cohesion to fight when they landed. That gap is not a narrative convenience. It is the engine of the story. The myth is not describing human endurance. It is describing something that transcends it, which is the point. Jason's crew were not ordinary men, and what they are about to find at the end of this crossing will require them to be less ordinary still. They arrived. After roughly 3 weeks of coastal sailing along the southern shore of the Black Sea, stops for water at river mouths, stops for food in hostile territory, encounters with the Babrices, whose king Amycus, at nearly 8 feet tall by the tradition's description, challenged every visitor to a boxing match and was finally beaten to death by Pollux, encounters with the Mariandini, encounters with peoples whose names the Greeks recorded imperfectly and whose languages they did not speak. The Argo reached the eastern end of the sea. The river Phasis emptied into the Black Sea through a broad, marshy delta, and up the river, in the foothills where the land began to climb toward the Caucasus, lay the capital of Colchis. Modern Georgia, at the foot of some of the tallest mountains in Europe. The end of the Greek world. Beyond this, the maps were blank. Colchis was real. Archaeological evidence confirms a sophisticated Bronze Age culture in the region. Advanced metalworking, organized agriculture, extensive trade networks connecting the Caucasus to Mesopotamia and the Aegean. Georgian archaeologists have excavated sites dating to the 2nd millennium BCE that reveal a culture far more advanced than the Greek myths suggest. The myths present Colchis as exotic and distant, but the archaeological record shows a civilization that was, in many respects, the equal of its Mycenaean Greek contemporaries in metallurgical skill and possibly superior in certain specialties. The Greeks associated Colchis with gold, and not without reason. The rivers coming down from the Caucasus Mountains carried alluvial gold. Fine particles eroded from the mountain's gold-bearing quartz veins, washed down by snowmelt and spring rains, deposited in the gravel beds of the lower river reaches. The local technique for extracting this gold, described by Strabo and confirmed by later observers, involved laying sheepskins in the riverbed with the fleece side up. The wool fibers trapped the gold particles as the water flowed over them. After days or weeks of exposure, the fleece was removed, dried and shaken or burned to recover the gold. The fleece turned golden, literally golden, stiff with fine metal particles, glowing in sunlight with a warm, unmistakable luster, a golden fleece. That detail, sheepskins trapping gold dust in mountain rivers, is the kind of thing that, once you hear it, restructures the entire myth around it. The myth may preserve, beneath its accumulated layers of divine intervention and impossible tasks, a genuine memory of Bronze Age trade. Greek sailors voyaging east along the Black Sea coast for Caucasian gold, arriving at the river Phasis, finding the local commodity trapped in the wool of sheepskins staked in mountain rivers. The quest for the Golden Fleece as a trade mission, the dragon that guards it as a metaphor for the dangers of the journey. Jason as a merchant captain, mythologized beyond recognition by centuries of oral tradition. That possibility has never been proven, but it has never been dismissed either. I spent a week going back and forth on whether to include it. The archaeological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, and I did not want to overstate the case, but the detail is too specific, too practical, too rooted in a real technique that was actually used in the region for centuries to be pure invention. Something happened on the coast of Georgia in the Bronze Age. The Greeks remembered it, and they made it into the greatest adventure story of their civilization. An adventure whose hero, remember, contributed almost nothing to its success. The man who stood at the helm while other people did the work. That pattern is about to repeat, because the next person Jason meets will do more for the quest than every Argonaut combined, and she will pay for it with everything she has. King Aeetes ruled Colchis, son of Helios, the sun, brother of Circe, the sorceress who would later trap Odysseus on her island, father of Medea. The divine genealogy is important. This is a family of sun and sorcery of power exercised not through armies, but through knowledge. Knowledge of herbs, of animals, of the invisible forces that operate beneath the surface of the natural world. Aeetes was not a warrior king, he was something more dangerous. He was a king who understood things. Jason came ashore and made his request. He wanted the Golden Fleece. He had sailed from Greece to collect it. He was the son of a king. He had rights, or at least claims. And he made them formally, in the diplomatic language of Bronze Age royal courts, with the appropriate gestures of respect and the implied backing of Hera and Athena, whose support he could reference but not prove. Aeetes listened. He did not say number. Saying no would have been simple. What he did was worse, because it was designed to look fair. "Bring me proof of your worth," he said. "Yoke my bronze bulls." They breathe fire, and they were forged by Hephaestus. But if you are the hero you claim to be, you should be able to manage them. Once yoked, plow a field. Once plowed, sow the field with dragon's teeth. Warriors will spring from the ground, armed men, fully grown, aggressive, and you must kill them all before sunset. Do this, and the fleece is yours. The tasks were impossible. Actually, impossible understates it. The bronze bulls alone would kill any man who approached them. Their breath was literal fire, hot enough to melt bronze armor, and their hooves were made of the same divine metal that Hephaestus used for the armor of the gods. The dragon's teeth warriors were an army generated from nothing, appearing fully armed and hostile, with no negotiation possible. Even if Jason survived the bulls, the warriors would finish him. And even if he somehow survived both, Aeetes had no intention of honoring the bargain. He would have killed Jason on the spot rather than surrender the fleece. Jason knew this. Everyone knew it. The crew knew it. The challenge was not a test. It was an execution with extra steps. And here is where the impossibility of Jason's heroism becomes inescapable, because he does not solve the problem. He does not rise to the challenge through courage or strength or cleverness. He does not become the hero. The myth seems to require. Instead, someone else solves it for him. Someone whose name the myth remembers more clearly than his. That someone is already watching from a window in her father's palace. She has been watching since the Argo entered the harbor, and she has already begun to understand. Before the gods have even decided to interfere, that this stranger is going to change everything about her life. She just does not know yet that change and destruction are, in her case, the same thing. She was not what the later tradition made her. That needs to be said first, because the name Medea carries weight. Baggage, associations, horror. Euripides wrote the definitive version of her story in 431 BCE, and in that version, she is a woman who murders her own children. That image, the infanticide, the flying chariot, the cold-eyed monster who destroys everything she once loved, has dominated the Western imagination for 25 centuries. When people hear Medea, they hear child killer. But Euripides was writing about the end. Tonight we are starting at the beginning. And at the beginning, Medea is something much more complex, much more human, and much more interesting than a monster. She was the daughter of King Aeetes, granddaughter of Helios, the sun. Niece of Circe, She was born into a family where power expressed itself not through swords, but through knowledge. The knowledge of herbs, poisons, healing, transformation. The women of this line were pharmakides, the Greek word from which we get pharmacist, and pharmaceutical, but which in the ancient world meant something closer to one who knows the properties of substances. They knew which plants healed and which killed. They knew how to alter perception, induce unconsciousness, cure disease, drive men mad. Their knowledge was old and deep and dangerous, and the Greek world had no comfortable category for women who possessed it. Medea was a priestess of Hecate. This is important. Hecate was the goddess of crossroads, of thresholds, of the boundary between the known and the unknown. She was a night goddess. Her worship involved torches and dogs and offerings left at three-way crossroads after dark. To be a priestess of Hecate meant standing, permanently, at the intersection of the visible and the invisible, the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural. It meant having access to knowledge that most people found terrifying and preferred not to think about. When Jason arrived in Colchis, Medea was a young woman. The sources do not give a precise age, but the context, unmarried, living in her father's palace, described by Apollonius with the language of girlhood rather than maturity, suggests late adolescence, perhaps 16, perhaps 18, old enough to have spent at least 6 or 7 years in formal training under Hecate's priesthood. Initiation typically began at age 10 or 11 in chthonic cult traditions, old enough to have completed years of training in the arts of Hecate. Young enough that what happened next had the power to remake her completely. Hera and Athena arranged it. The two goddesses, Jason's divine patrons, recognized that he could not complete Aeetes' tasks on his own. No mortal could. The bulls alone would kill him. So they went to Aphrodite, goddess of love, and asked her to intervene. Aphrodite sent her son Eros, the boy with the arrows, the original Cupid, to Colchis, and Eros shot Medea with an arrow of desire. I need to pause on this because it is easy to gloss over, and it should not be glossed over. Medea's love for Jason was induced. It was not natural attraction, not a meeting of minds, not the slow development of affection between equals. A god shot her with an arrow that altered her emotional chemistry, and she fell in love with a stranger against her will. Every sacrifice she makes, every betrayal of her family, every act of violence, every piece of herself she burns to keep Jason alive, originates in an act of divine coercion. She did not choose this. She was chosen by gods who needed her skills and did not care about her consent. And the man she was chosen for, remember, is the man who cannot do anything himself. The hero who did nothing is about to receive everything, from a woman who was given no choice in the giving. When did Medea decide? At what precise moment? Which night? Which prayer? Which long hour in the temple of Hecate? Did she cross the threshold from resisting to committing? The arrow is the myth's answer. But Apollonius, who is more honest than most, shows you the weeks of internal warfare that preceded the surrender. I almost didn't include that framing. It feels anachronistic, importing modern ideas of consent into a myth that predates the concept by millennia. But the more I sat with Apollonius's text, the more I realized the discomfort is not modern, it is in the poem. He put it there. Perhaps that is too modern a reading. The Greeks may not have drawn a sharp line between natural desire and divinely induced desire. To them, all love was the work of Aphrodite, all passion was a form of divine interference. And the distinction between choosing to love and being forced to love was not as clear as we would like it to be. But the text knows, Apollonius knows. He describes Medea's internal struggle, the war between loyalty to her father and desire for Jason. With a psychological precision that is startling for a 3rd century BCE poet, she paces, she weeps, she considers poison for Jason or for herself. She debates internally whether to help a stranger betray her father or to watch that stranger die. The arrow has already decided. But Apollonius shows you the wound. She chose Jason, or the arrow chose for her. The distinction collapses under the weight of what happens next. She met him at night. At the temple of Hecate, her own sacred space, where she had the home-ground advantage of a priestess in her goddess's house, she brought him a pharmacon. A magical ointment brewed from a plant that had grown from the blood of Prometheus. When applied to the skin, it made the wearer invulnerable to fire and iron for a single day. One day, 12 hours of immunity, and then the protection faded and the body was mortal again. She gave it to him and told him how to use it. Anoint your body, anoint your shield and your spear. You will be able to withstand the fire of the bulls and the swords of the earth-born warriors. But only for one day. When the sun sets, you are mortal again. And she told him the trick for the dragon's teeth warriors. When they spring from the ground, throw a stone into their midst. They will not know who threw it. They will turn on each other and fight among themselves. Let them destroy themselves. This is the moment, the pivot of the entire myth. Everything that Jason is credited with. The yoking of the bulls, the plowing of the field, the defeat of the earth-born warriors, is Medea's work. Her knowledge, her ointment, her strategy. She gives him invulnerability, and she gives him the tactical intelligence to survive the second challenge. Without her, he dies on the field before the first bull reaches him. Without her, there is no quest, no fleece, no triumphant return. The impossibility at the heart of this myth is not a monster, or a magic artifact. It is a hero who accomplishes nothing and receives credit for everything. And what does Jason give in return? A promise. He promises to marry her. He promises to take her to Greece. He promises that her sacrifice, the betrayal of her father, the abandonment of her home, the destruction of everything she has ever known, will be rewarded with a new life in a new land with a husband who will honor her. He does not keep this promise. The myth knows he will not keep this promise. Every audience that has ever heard this story knows he will not keep this promise, and Medea, brilliant, powerful, capable Medea, who could brew invulnerability from the blood of a titan, who could silence a dragon that had never known silence, who could break bronze with her mind, cannot see the future clearly enough to recognize the shape of a lie when it is standing in front of her wearing the face of a handsome Greek prince. The arrow of Eros has blinded her to the one thing her intelligence should have shown her first. There is something in this that I find difficult to sit with, and I suspect it is meant to be difficult. The myth is not asking you to judge Medea. It is asking you to watch a brilliant woman make a catastrophic decision, and to recognize, with the slow, nauseating clarity of hindsight, that the decision was not really hers. It was made for her, by gods, by an arrow, by a system that needed her skills and did not care about her future. Tomorrow morning, Jason will walk onto the field of Ares. He will carry a shield anointed with something that smells of smoke, and crushed herbs and the deep cold of a titan's blood, and no one watching from the walls of the palace. Not Aeetes, not the gathered crowd, not the Argonauts who knew nothing of what Medea had done in the dark, will understand what they are actually seeing, which is a woman performing the most dangerous work of her life, while a man takes all the credit for simply showing up. The next morning, Jason walked onto the field of Ares and he did not burn. The bulls came first. 2 bronze animals the size of actual bulls, but made entirely of divine metal, smoke pouring from their nostrils, fire erupting with every exhalation. The heat shimmered off their hides. The ground around them was scorched black. They charged, and Jason, covered in Medea's ointment, protected by the blood of Prometheus, walked into the fire. It rolled over him like warm rain. The bronze hooves struck his shield and bounced. He seized the bulls by their horns and forced them to the ground, one after the other, and yoked them to a plow of adamantine that Aeetes had provided, never expecting it to be used. He plowed. Remember the ointment, Medea's ointment, brewed from the blood of Prometheus, effective for exactly 1 day. Every second on this field is borrowed time. The bronze bulls, smoking and furious but unable to break the yoke, dragged the plow through the stony ground of the field. The earth turned up dark. Almost black, the rich volcanic soil of the Colchian foothills, fed by centuries of runoff from the Caucasus. The furrows were straight. The work was steady. To anyone watching from a distance, it would have looked almost ordinary, a man plowing a field with a team of bulls. You would have to get close to see that the bulls were made of metal. And their breath was fire, and the man behind the plow was glowing faintly, with the residue of an ointment brewed from the blood of a titan. When the field was plowed, Jason took a helmet, his own bronze helmet, inverted, used as a seed basket, filled with dragon's teeth. The teeth of the dragon of Ares, each one roughly the size of a man's thumb, curved and yellowed and dense with the particular weight of something that has been alive for a very long time. He sowed them in the furrows, handful by handful, the way a farmer sows grain, each tooth landing in the dark soil and beginning immediately to germinate. The warriors grew like crops, fast. Within minutes, Apollonius suggests the first soldiers were fully upright within the span of a few dozen heartbeats. The first bronze helmets emerged from the soil, then shoulders, then torsos, then the full bodies of armed men climbing out of the earth like swimmers surfacing from dark water, fully formed. Fully armed, bronze armor, bronze shields, iron spears, their eyes flat and hostile. Not the eyes of men, but the eyes of weapons that happen to have human faces. Dozens of them, then scores. Row after row, climbing out of the furrows, standing on the field, looking for someone to kill. They did not speak. They had no names, no individuality, no capacity for negotiation or surrender. They were violence in human shape, sown as teeth and harvested as soldiers, their entire existence, from emergence to death, measured in a single afternoon. Jason threw the stone, Medea's trick. A single rock, picked up from the edge of the field, hurled into the center of the growing army. A simple, elegant piece of tactical psychology. The warriors did not see who threw it. Each assumed his nearest neighbor had attacked him. Suspicion cascaded through the ranks in milliseconds. They turned on each other. The field became a slaughter. Earthborn warriors hacking each other apart in blind, directionless rage, their blood soaking back into the soil from which they had sprung minutes before, completing a cycle of violence so tight and so contained that it was almost circular. Jason killed the survivors, methodically, efficiently, while they were still confused and scattered and turning on phantoms. By sunset, the field was empty, scorched, churned, blood-soaked, empty. He had done it, every task completed. The bulls yoked, the field plowed, the warriors destroyed. He stood on the field of Ares as the sun went down, covered in ash and blood and the drying residue of Medea's ointment, and he had earned the fleece, except he had not earned anything. Medea had earned it, her knowledge, her courage, her willingness to betray her father, and her people and her goddess. She had paid the price. Jason had been the instrument. The body that carried her gifts onto the field, the vehicle through which her brilliance expressed itself. He did not look at her hands that evening when she met him at the temple. He did not ask what it had cost her to brew the ointment, or to steal the dragon's teeth information from her father's secrets. He took what she gave and used it and called it his own. What does it feel like to give someone everything you have, and then watch them hold it as though it were simply theirs? The fleece was in Jason's hands. Medea was standing in the dark grove, smelling of juniper smoke and crushed herbs, her hands still trembling from the expenditure of power. And Jason was already turning toward the harbor. The myth could have ended here, with Jason collecting the fleece and sailing home. But Aedes had no intention of honoring the agreement. He planned to burn the Argo in the harbor and kill the entire crew. Medea learned of the plan. How, the sources do not specify, but a priestess of Hecate in her father's palace had ways of learning things. And she went to Jason in the night and told him they had to act immediately. She led him to the grove. The sacred grove of Ares, where the fleece hung from a branch of an ancient oak, guarded by a dragon that never slept. The grove was dark. Not the ordinary darkness of night in a forest, but an older darkness. The darkness of a place that was sacred to the god of war, where blood had been spilled in ritual for centuries, where the ground itself was saturated with the residue of sacrifice. The trees were old, the air was warm and heavy and still, the particular stillness of a place where nothing moves because everything is watching. It smelled of iron and damp earth and something else, something vegetal and sweet, like rotting flowers, like the smell of a thing that has been alive for too long. The ground underfoot was soft. Not mud, softer than mud, the accumulated leaf fall of centuries compressed into something that gave way silently beneath each step and held the impression after. The dragon was enormous. Coiled around the base of the oak, its body as thick as the trunk of the tree it guarded, scales like hammered bronze, eyes that caught the faint light and reflected it back as 2 points of greenish fire. It did not sleep. It had never slept. It watched the grove with the eternal, patient vigilance of a creature whose only purpose was to watch. Medea stepped forward. She sang. Not a battle song, not an incantation in the dramatic sense, no thunderous invocations, no calling down of divine fire, a lullaby. That is the word Apollonius uses. She sang the dragon a lullaby. A soft, slow, repetitive melody, layered with words in a language that was older than Greek, in a tradition that went back through Hecate to the oldest chthonic powers. The powers that lived beneath the earth, in the roots, and the stones and the dark water that flows through underground rivers. She moved her hands in patterns that corresponded to the melody. Slow circles, figure eights, the gestures of someone who is smoothing the surface of something invisible. She sprinkled herbs. We do not know which ones. The later tradition associates her with juniper, the acrid smoke that was used throughout the ancient world for purification and for the induction of altered states. With laurel, sacred to Apollo, the god of prophecy, whose smoke was inhaled by the Pythia at Delphi before she spoke in the voice of the god. With the dark narcotic plants of the eastern Mediterranean. Henbane, perhaps, or white hellebore, or the juice of the poppy, which the ancient world understood intimately and used with a casual expertise that modern pharmacology finds both impressive and alarming. The smoke from the herbs mingled with the song and the dragon. The creature that had never slept, that had guarded the fleece for longer than any human memory, that had watched the grove with the infinite patience of a being that knew nothing except watching. Slowly, slowly, lowered its head. Its eyes dimmed, the pupils' vertical slits and irises of greenish fire contracted. The great scaled body relaxed against the base of the tree, coils loosening, the tension going out of muscles that had held their vigilance for generations. It did not close its eyes. Dragons in the Greek tradition do not have eyelids, which is why they were chosen as guardians in the first place, but its gaze lost focus. It went somewhere else. Into whatever place a sleepless creature goes when a priestess of Hecate sings it a song it cannot resist, some country on the other side of wakefulness. Some room that the dragon had never known existed, because it had never been allowed to enter it, because its entire existence had been defined by the absence of the one thing Medea was now offering it. Sleep. She gave the sleepless creature sleep, and in that gift, in that act of mercy toward a monster, there is something of the Medea that existed before the arrow. The Medea who knew how to heal as well as harm. The Medea who might have become, in another story, in a story where the gods had not needed her skills, and a prince had not needed her power, something other than what she became. Jason took the fleece. He reached up, unhooked it from the branch, and lifted it down. It was heavier than he expected. The sources describe it as heavy. Not just symbolically but physically, the way real gold is heavy, denser than it looks, pulling at the arms and the shoulders with a weight that is somehow wrong. Somehow more than the size of the object should allow. It shimmered in the darkness of the grove, its own light, independent of any external source. A golden glow, warm, like sunlight held in wool. He did not look at Medea's hands. I keep coming back to this. The image I cannot release, her hands after the charm. What did they smell like? Kaifi smoke and juniper. Crushed herbs. The particular residue of a magic that required everything she had. Her hands shaking, maybe, from the expenditure of power, or steady. Eerily steady, the hands of a professional who has just performed a procedure that no one else in the world could have performed, and Jason, holding the fleece, already turning toward the harbor. Already thinking about the Argo and the escape and the voyage home. Not looking back, not looking at her hands. She had given him everything. She would give him more before the night was over, and the price of what she gives next. Hold on to this, because it is the detail that separates this myth from every other quest story in Greek literature. The price is a person, someone she loves, someone whose body she will use as a tool. We said at the very beginning that this myth was designed to punish Jason. The punishment has not started yet. First, there is one more thing Medea must do, one more piece of herself she must burn. And it will be the one that cannot be taken back. They ran through the dark streets of Aegean's capital. Streets that Medea knew from childhood, that she had walked 1,000 times on her way to the temple of Hecate, that she was now fleeing through as a traitor, a thief. A woman who had chosen a stranger over her own blood. Through the harbor district, where the fishing boats were tied up for the night, and the smell of dried fish and tar hung in the warm air. To the Argo, waiting at the dock with its crew already aboard, the hull riding low in the water, the oars shipped and ready. The fleece was aboard, Medea was aboard, the mooring lines were cut. 50 oars entered the water, and the Argo surged forward into the darkness of the harbor. Behind them, the lights of the palace, the city she would never see again. The life she would never return to. Aeetes was not far behind. The king assembled his fleet within hours, Colchian warships. Lighter and faster than the Argo, because they were not weighed down by 50 heroes and a golden relic and the accumulated exhaustion of months of voyaging. The Colchian fleet knew these waters. Every current, every shoal, every wind pattern that the Argo's crew had to learn by trial and error, the Colchians knew by instinct. They pursued the Argo west, out of the harbor, along the coast, into the open Black Sea. The chase lasted days, and during those days, as the Colchian fleet drew closer, as the gap narrowed and the prospect of recapture became real, Medea made her choice. Her younger brother Absyrtus was aboard the pursuing fleet. In some versions of the myth, he was aboard the Argo itself, taken as a hostage by Medea before the escape. In other versions, he commanded one of the pursuing ships. The details vary. What does not vary is the outcome. Medea killed her brother. She killed him and dismembered him and threw the pieces into the sea behind the Argo, one by one, so that Aeetes would have to stop and collect the fragments of his son's body for proper burial. A father could not sail past the scattered remains of his child. The ritual obligations of the dead were absolute. More powerful than rage, more powerful than the desire for vengeance, more powerful than the need to recover a stolen relic. Aeetes stopped. He gathered the pieces. By the time his son was reassembled, the Argo was gone. What does a person become when there is nothing left to lose? When every line they said they would never cross has already been crossed, and the only direction is forward. And forward is only possible by doing the next unthinkable thing? I am not going to soften this. I almost didn't. This is a story meant for the quiet hours, and what follows is not gentle. But the myth does not soften it, and I will not do the myth, the disservice of making it comfortable. Medea killed her own brother and used his body as a delaying tactic. She dismembered him, a child, a boy, her father's youngest son, and scattered him across the surface of the sea like bait. This is where the myth turns, not the dramatic turn of a plot twist, but a deeper turn, a moral turn. The adventure story is over. What remains is a story about debt. About what people become when they have sacrificed too much to turn back. Medea has betrayed her father, abandoned her home, forsaken her goddess, and murdered her brother, all for Jason. All because a god shot her with an arrow and called it love. She cannot go home. She has no home. The only thing she has is Jason's promise, and Jason's promise is the one thing the audience already knows, from Euripides, from the whole tradition that Jason will not keep. The Argo sailed west. The route home was not the same as the route out. The myths describe a wandering, circuitous return, some versions sending the Argonauts up the Danube, others through the Adriatic, others along the coast of North Africa. The geography is confused, probably intentionally. The return voyage has the dream logic of a journey that is happening in myth time rather than real time, where the landscape shifts to accommodate the narrative rather than the other way around. They stopped at the island of the home of Circe, Medea's aunt, the sorceress who would later trap Odysseus. Medea went to Circe for purification. The ritual cleansing of blood guilt, the removal of the spiritual contamination of murder. Circe performed the rites. She sprinkled the blood of a slaughtered pig over Medea's hands and burned the offerings and spoke the words. But when the ritual was complete, she looked at her niece and said, "Leave. Leave my island. I know what you have done, and the cleansing is formal, not real. The stain remains. You cannot wash off what you are becoming. I find myself returning to this detail." Circe, who was herself a dangerous woman, a sorceress who turned men into pigs and kept them penned like livestock, looking at her own niece and being afraid. Not of what Medea had done. Circe had done terrible things herself. Circe was afraid of what Medea would do. She could see the trajectory. She could read the arc, the way a mathematician reads a curve, extrapolating forward from the data points of betrayal and fratricide and exile, and she could see where it was going. She wanted no part of it. The Argo sailed on. Orpheus played his lyre as they passed the island of the Sirens. The creatures whose song was so beautiful it killed, drawing sailors toward the rocks with a promise of something that sounded like home, and was not. Orpheus played louder. He played harder. He played with the full force of a son of Apollo, channeling divine music through mortal hands, and his song drowned the sirens out. The crew survived because one impossible voice defeated another impossible voice, and the ship passed through the strait of singing death as though it were ordinary water. Only one man nearly succumbed. Budes, an Argonaut from Athens, heard the sirens through Orpheus's music, a faint thread of their song slipping through the cracks in his defense, and threw himself overboard. Aphrodite saved him, plucking him from the water before he reached the rocks. But the rest of the crew heard only Orpheus, and Orpheus's song was enough. After the sirens, the wandering rocks of the Planctae, another marine hazard that the Argo survived through skill and divine assistance. Thetis. The sea nymph who would later be the mother of Achilles, the sea nymph Peleus had married. Helped guide the Argo through, lifting the hull over submerged reefs with her own hands, her sisters the Nereids pushing the ship from below. Even the sea itself was helping. Even the water wanted the Argo to reach home. The ship had become something larger than its crew. A symbol, a project, a collective investment of divine and mortal will that had grown too significant to be allowed to fail. But the sea had one more guardian, and this one, Medea would have to destroy alone. It was waiting for them on the shore of Crete. Something that had been built by a god, operated for decades without pause or error, and had never once failed to drive away every ship that came near. It was about to meet the one thing in the ancient world it had not been built to withstand, a woman who had already lost everything she was afraid of losing. The Argo came to Crete. If you heard our entry on Talos, the first robot in history, the bronze guardian that patrolled the shores of Crete 3 times daily, then you know what the Argonauts found when they tried to land. A figure of living bronze, 3 times the height of a man, standing on the headland, picking up boulders from the cliff face, and hurling them at the ship with the mechanical precision of a siege engine. Talos forged by Hephaestus, given to King Minos, standing roughly 30 feet tall by the tradition's account, 3 times the height of a man, roughly the height of a 3-story building. And programmed, and that is the right word, the modern word, the word that reveals how close the ancient imagination came to concepts we think of as recent. Programmed to destroy any vessel that approached the coast without authorization. The Argo could not land. The boulders were too accurate and too large. Tiphys's replacement at the helm. Tiphys had died of illness weeks before, and his absence was felt now more than ever. Tried every approach angle, every evasive pattern. Nothing worked. Talos adjusted. He tracked the ship. He predicted its movements. He was, in the language of modern robotics, an adaptive threat response system, and he had been operating without maintenance or error for decades. Medea stood up. She had been quiet during the final legs of the voyage. After Circe, after the dismemberment of Absyrtus, after the long days of sailing through unfamiliar waters with a crew that feared her, and a lover who was already beginning to look past her. She had been quiet, but now she stood at the prow of the Argo and looked at the bronze giant on the shore and did what no one else on the ship could do. She broke him with her mind. I need you to hold that image for a moment. A woman standing at the prow of a wooden ship, 100 yards from shore, staring at a 30-foot bronze automaton, and winning. The details vary by source. In Apollonius, she uses the charis, spirits of death, summoned through an act of concentrated will that the poet describes with a vocabulary of effort and strain. As though Medea is lifting something enormously heavy with a muscle that has no physical location. She fixes her gaze on Talos. She calls the charis. She projects the evil eye, a focused beam of destructive intent. At the one vulnerability in Talos's construction, the membrane covering the vein in his ankle, the single sealed channel through which the divine ichor, the fluid of the gods, the liquid that served as both blood and fuel, flowed through his bronze body. The membrane ruptured. The ichor poured out. Not like blood, like molten lead, thick and luminous, running down the bronze ankle and pooling on the rocks. Talos staggered. The light in his eyes, whatever served as consciousness in that bronze skull, dimmed. He swayed on the headland. For a moment he was still standing, the way a tree is still standing in the instant before it falls. Then he toppled. The bronze body hit the rocks with a sound that carried across the water to the Argo's deck. A deep, metallic concussion that the crew felt through the hull planks before they heard it with their ears. The first robot in history destroyed by a woman's concentrated will. If you have heard our entry on Talos, you know the full story of his construction. The forge of Hephaestus, the divine ichor, the single vein that ran from his neck to his ankle, sealed by a bronze nail or a membrane depending on the source. You know what he represented, the first artificial intelligence in Western literature, the first autonomous machine, the first constructed being with the capacity for independent decision-making. And you know that a woman standing on the prow of a ship, hundreds of yards away, found his one weakness and exploited it with nothing but the focused force of her mind. The strongest artificial being in the ancient world, brought down not by a stronger force but by a more precise one, a priestess of Hecate who understood that every system has a vulnerability. Every wall has a crack, every armor has a gap, every sealed vein has a membrane. And that the way to destroy something invincible is not to overpower it, but to find the one place where it can be reached. The crew was terrified of her. That is clear from the sources, and it is clear from the structural choices the poets make in the aftermath of the Talos scene. After the bronze giant fell, the Argonauts looked at Medea differently. Not with gratitude, not with admiration, not with the respect that her repeated salvation of the expedition should have earned. With fear, she had killed a bronze giant with her mind. She had put a sleepless dragon to sleep. She had brewed invulnerability from the blood of Prometheus. She had murdered her own brother and scattered his body across the sea. What else could she do? What else might she do if provoked, if betrayed, if pushed past the boundary of whatever patience she still possessed? The crew did not want to find out. they kept their distance. They spoke to her carefully. They watched her the way you watch a fire that is contained but not controlled. And here's what gets me. Jason did not comfort her. He did not thank her. The sources record no conversation between them after Talos fell. The fleece was in the hold. The voyage was almost over. Medea had saved his life again. How many times now? The ointment, the dragon, the escape, the bronze giant. And Jason's gratitude is nowhere in the text. It is not mentioned because it does not exist, or if it exists, it is so small, so perfunctory, so inadequate to the scale of what she has given, that the poet does not bother to record it. The Argo sailed north from Crete, toward Greece. Toward home, and toward the one thing Medea could not break with her mind, could not charm into stillness, could not dissolve with the focused force of her will, Jason's promise, which was already, even now, beginning to rot. Quietly, the way wood rots, from the inside out, invisible until the structure gives way. The homecoming was supposed to be the end of the story. It was not. It was where the real story began. The myth had been quietly assembling since the moment Jason arrived in Iolcus wearing one sandal, with a king's usurped throne waiting for him. And no idea what the recovery would actually cost. They returned to Iolcus. The Argo entered the Pagasetic Gulf from the south, the same waters she had left months, years in some tellings before. The hull was different now. Salt-stained. Patched in multiple places where damage had been repaired with whatever timber was available at the nearest shore. Barnacles crusted the waterline. The pitch was worn thin. The oars were mismatched. Some original ash, some replacements carved from whatever hardwood the crew could find at their various stops. The sail was patched. The rigging was frayed. She was still the Argo. She was still the ship Athena had designed, but she wore her voyage the way a soldier wears a campaign, in the damage, in the repairs, in the visible evidence of everything she had survived. The hull slid into the harbor at Pegazi. The water here was warmer than the open sea. Sheltered, sun-soaked, holding the day's heat the way stone holds it, releasing it slowly into the evening air. The fleece was aboard, glowing faintly in the hold, casting a warm golden light on the bilge water and the ballast stones and the undersides of the deck planks. Jason had succeeded. The impossible quest was complete. The death sentence that Pelias had disguised as a heroic mission had been survived, and the survivor had returned with the prize. Pelias was still alive. Still on the throne, he had expected Jason to die. Had been so confident of it that he had made no contingency plan for Jason's return, and now the usurper was faced with a promise he had never intended to keep. Delivered by a man he had never expected to see again, backed by a crew of 50 heroes who had just crossed the known world and fought monsters and lost friends and were not. At this particular moment, in a mood to be told that the deal was off. There are several versions of what happened next. In most of them, Pelias refused to surrender the throne. He had not survived decades of political maneuvering and ruthless consolidation of power to be undone by a nephew with a gold-plated sheepskin and a boatload of tired soldiers. He stalled. He negotiated. He raised procedural objections. He questioned the authenticity of the fleece. He did everything a man in his position would do to delay the reckoning he could see approaching. Medea solved the problem. Remember what we said at the very beginning. The myth was designed, from its earliest layers, to punish Jason. This is where the punishment begins. Not with thunder and divine wrath, with something far more precise, a sorceress, a cauldron. And daughters who loved their father, she went to the daughters of Pelias, the old king's own children. And she performed a demonstration. She took an old ram, cut it into pieces, dropped the pieces into a cauldron of boiling water along with certain herbs. The room would have smelled of copper and juniper and something darker, something animal. And spoke certain words. The ram emerged from the cauldron young again, reborn, rejuvenated, a dead, dismembered animal, restored to life and youth by the power of Medea's knowledge. The daughters were amazed. Medea suggested, gently, that she could do the same for their father. Peleus was old. Peleus was failing. Would his daughters not want to give him back his youth? They would. Of course they would. They loved their father. And so, following Medea's instructions, they cut the old king into pieces and dropped him into the cauldron. Medea did not add the herbs. She did not speak the words. Peleus did not emerge from the cauldron. The usurper was dead. Killed by his own daughters, manipulated by a woman whose capacity for creative cruelty had been sharpened by months of sacrifice and loss and the growing terrible suspicion that she had destroyed her life for a man who was not worth it. Jason had the throne, or should have had it, but the manner of Peleus's death, parricide by deception, engineered by a foreign sorceress, horrified the people of Iolcus. Jason and Medea were driven out, exiled. The throne that Jason had crossed the world to reclaim was denied to him not by the usurper, but by the method of the usurper's removal. The violence that had purchased his freedom now purchased his banishment. The impossible hero. The man who could not even claim his own throne without someone else doing the impossible work for him. They went to Corinth. Jason and Medea, exiled from Iolcus, settled in the city of King Creon. They had children. 2 sons, in most versions. Remember those sons. They lived there for years, 10, according to some sources, a decade, 3,650 days of something resembling normalcy. A family, a home. A life that might have healed them if healing had been available, if the debts incurred during the voyage could have been slowly, gradually, worn down by ordinary domestic peace. They could not. The debts were too large. The silence between them was too full of things that could not be unsaid, and acts that could not be undone. Medea had killed her brother for this man. She had betrayed her father, her goddess, her people. She had put a sleepless dragon to sleep and broken a bronze giant with nothing but her will. And Jason, what had Jason given in return? A place in a foreign house, a title wife in a language that was not her own. Children who would grow up Greek, not Colchian, who would speak their father's language and worship their father's gods and know their mother as something exotic and slightly frightening. The foreign woman with the strange knowledge and the blood-stained past. 10 years of this. And then Jason did something that even the myth seems to find difficult to explain. He found a way to repay everything Medea had sacrificed. Every betrayal, every death, every act of sorcery performed on his behalf. With a single, quiet, devastatingly ordinary act of selfishness, and Medea, who had tamed a creature that had never known stillness and broken a bronze giant with nothing but focused will, was about to discover the one problem she could not solve with her skills. Jason abandoned Medea, after everything, after the ointment and the dragon and the fleece, after Apsartus dismembered and scattered across the Black Sea. After the flight from Colchis and the cleansing at Circe's island that cleansed nothing, after Talos, broken on the rocks of Crete, after 10 years of marriage and 2 sons and a life in Corinth that had the shape of normalcy but not the substance of it. 10 years, roughly 3,650 mornings of waking beside a woman who had crossed 1,500 miles of hostile water for him. After all of it. After every sacrifice, every betrayal, every act of violence committed on his behalf. Jason decided to marry Glauce, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth. A political marriage, a strategic move. Glauce was young, well-connected, and this is the word that matters, Greek. She was native, she belonged. She offered Jason what Medea, with all her power and all her sacrifice, could never offer, legitimacy in a society that had tolerated the Colchian sorceress but never accepted her. Medea was always the foreign wife, the barbarian woman, the one with the strange herbs, and the dangerous knowledge and the reputation that preceded her into every room and emptied it of trust. He told Medea it was for the children. That a Greek stepmother would give their sons better standing, better prospects, a future in a world that judged people first by their blood, and second by their behavior. He may have believed this. I think he may have genuinely believed it, because people who betray others almost always construct a version of events in which the betrayal is, really, if you think about it carefully, a form of kindness. Medea heard the words. She understood what they meant, every layer of what they meant. Not just the personal betrayal, though that was immense. A husband leaving a wife for a younger woman, the oldest and most banal form of cruelty between two people who once shared a bed. But the structural betrayal, the cosmic betrayal. She had given up everything: family, home, country, language, identity. The grove of Hecate where she had been priestess. The palace where she had been princess. The father she had betrayed. The brother she had killed. She had crossed the world for this man. She had committed murder and fratricide and acts of sorcery that left residue on her hands that no ritual could wash away. She had done all of this because Jason asked her to. Because a god's arrow told her to, because the system needed her and used her and was now, with Jason's announcement, discarding her, and the cruelest part. The part that Euripides understood better than anyone who has ever written about it is that Jason believed he was being reasonable. He believed the new marriage was practical. He believed that Medea should accept it gracefully, should recognize the political logic, should see that a Greek wife would benefit everyone, including her, including the children. He stood in front of the woman who had given him everything, and explained calmly and rationally why everything she had given was not quite enough. Euripides wrote the definitive version of what happened next, and his version is so famous, so influential, so burned into the Western literary tradition that I do not need to describe it in detail. You know what Medea did, or if you do not know the specifics, you know the shape of it. The poisoned gifts, the death of Glauce, the death of Creon, and then the act that made Medea's name a synonym for maternal horror. She killed her children, her own sons, to punish Jason. To take from him the one thing she could still reach. I am not going to linger here. Not because the details are unimportant, but because Euripides told this part of the story better than anyone ever will, and there is nothing I can add to it except context. And the context is this: the myth of Jason and the Argonauts is not an adventure story. It was never an adventure story. It is a story about debt. About what happens when one person sacrifices everything for another and the other person does not pay. And honestly, every ancient version of the myth punishes Jason, not Medea Jason. Medea escapes. Think about the 90-minute threshold again, the limit of what mortal endurance could sustain. Medea made that limit irrelevant. She crossed every boundary the ancient world drew around women, around foreigners, around mortals who dared to negotiate with gods. And her reward is survival. She escapes. In Euripides, she flies away in a chariot pulled by dragons, sent by her grandfather Helios, the sun. She goes to Athens, where King Aegeus has offered her refuge. She survives, she endures, she becomes something monstrous, yes, but she survives. Jason is the one the myth destroys. Not through dramatic divine punishment, but through the slow, grinding removal of everything he valued: his new wife, his father-in-law, his children, his reputation, his city, his future. The myth was designed this way. From its earliest layers, from the pre-literary oral traditions that preceded Apollonius and Euripides by centuries, the story of Jason is a story about a man who borrows everything and repays nothing. A man who takes credit for achievements that belong to others. A man whose only real skill is being chosen. Chosen by Hera, chosen by Athena, chosen by Medea. And who mistakes being chosen for being worthy? An impossible hero in the truest sense, a man who shouldn't exist at the center of this story, and yet there he is. Think about that for a moment. The myth calls him a hero. It gives him the quest, the ship, the crew, the fleece. And then it destroys him, because the myth is smarter than its protagonist. The myth knows that Jason is hollow, that the center of the story is empty, that the protagonist is the least important person in his own adventure, and the myth punishes him for it. Not by killing him quickly, but by letting him live long enough to understand what he has lost. What remains is one last scene: the old man and the old ship, and the beam of Dodona, which warned him all those years ago on the Black Sea that the price would be too high, is about to deliver its final message, not in words, in weight. Jason, old and broken, returned to the shore. The sources give us almost nothing about the intervening years after Medea's departure. After the dragon chariot lifted into the sky, and the screaming stopped and the smoke cleared, and Jason stood in the ruins of his second life the way he had stood in the ruins of his first. There is silence. The great mythological tradition, which had followed Jason across the known world, which had documented every island and every monster and every divine intervention with meticulous care, simply loses interest. He is no longer the subject of the story. He has become the aftermath of the story. And aftermaths do not get their own myths. He wandered. That is all the sources say. And it is worth pausing to notice how unusual that silence is. Greek mythology does not lose track of its heroes. It accounts for them. It gives them deaths, afterlives, constellations, cults. Jason gets none of that. He gets a gap. He wandered Greece for what the tradition implies was roughly 20 years. The same length of time he had spent on Pelion being prepared for greatness, now spent in reverse, being dismantled by it. Kingdomless, wifeless, childless, crewless. The Argonauts had dispersed decades before, gone to their own fates. Heracles, eventually killed by the poisoned blood of the centaur Nessus. Orpheus, torn apart by Maenads. Peleus, outliving his son Achilles. One by one, the crew of the Argo aged and died or were killed or were transformed, and the last generation of heroes became the subject of stories told by the next generation. And then by the generation after that, and then by people who had never met anyone who had met anyone who had sailed on the ship. Jason went to the place where it had started, not to Iolcus. He had no claim on Iolcus anymore, had not had a claim in decades. Not to Corinth. Corinth was ashes and memory and the ghosts of his children. He went to the harbor at Pagasai, where the Argo had been launched long ago on a bright, windless morning while Chiron waved the infant Achilles' hand from the waterline. The Argo was still there. Beached. Hauled up on the shore above the high tide line, her hull resting on timber supports that were themselves beginning to rot, her mast stepped down and laid alongside the hull. Her oars removed and long since lost or repurposed or burned for firewood by people who did not know what they were burning. She had been dedicated to Poseidon. A temple offering, a retired vessel given to the god of the sea as thanks for a voyage the god had not particularly supported and had, on more than one occasion, actively tried to prevent. The pitch on her hull was cracking. Deep fissures in the black coating, like the craquelure on an old painting, exposing the pale wood beneath. The pine planks were splitting along the grain as the wood dried and shrank and lost the moisture that had kept it supple. Salt crystals bloomed on the surface in white, powdery patches. The residue of a lifetime of seawater, crystallizing out as the wood dried, eating into the fibers. The oar ports gaped. The bench thwarts had warped and pulled away from the hull ribs. Barnacles from her last mooring clung to the lower hull in dense, calcified clusters. Dead now, dried out, the shells still gripping the wood with the tenacity of creatures that had evolved to hold on, and had never evolved to let go. She was rotting, the greatest ship ever built. Designed by Athena, launched with the prayers of a generation, crewed by the finest heroes of an age, was falling apart on a beach, quietly, without drama. The way all wood falls apart when it is removed from the conditions that sustained it and left to the slow, patient work of air and moisture and the organisms that break complex structures down into simple ones. Wood does that, even sacred wood, even wood that once carried a voice, even the ship that ended the clashing rocks and crossed the Black Sea and held a golden fleece in its hold. Given enough time and enough weather, all wood returns to the earth. Jason slept beneath her, The sources are sparse on this period of his life. The adventure was over. The drama was over. The interesting parts of Jason's story had been told, and what remained was an aging man without a throne, without a wife, without children, without a crew, without a quest. Sleeping in the shade of a decomposing ship. The least interesting man in his own mythology finally arrived at the destination the myth had always intended for him: irrelevance. He slept beneath the Argo's hull, in the strip of shade that the beached vessel cast on the sand. The pine resin still scented the air faintly, an echo of the pitch that the shipwrights had applied decades before, when the wood was fresh, and the sap still ran and the planks were tight enough to keep the sea out. Now the smell was fainter. Older, the smell of something that used to be alive, and in the bow, the beam of Dodona oak, the speaking beam. We have held on to this image since the very first chapter. The plank of Dodona oak fitted into the prow, the oldest oracle in Greece, the voice of Zeus trapped in timber. It warned Jason on the Black Sea. It told him the price would be too high. It argued and prophesied and fell silent. And now here it is again, the beam that spoke more clearly than any god in this story, waiting in the prow of a rotting ship on a quiet beach. The plank that carried the voice of Zeus, that had warned and argued and prophesied through the entire voyage. It had not spoken in years. The ancient sources do not say when the beam fell silent. Whether it was a gradual fading, like a voice growing hoarse, or a sudden cessation, like a door closing. But by the time Jason came to sleep beneath the Argo, the beam was silent, the voice was gone. Whatever divine presence had inhabited the wood had withdrawn, leaving behind nothing but grain and cellulose and the slow molecular dissolution that is the fate of all organic material exposed to air and weather and time. And then, the detail I mentioned at the very beginning, the one I asked you to hold. The beam fell, rotted free of its mortise joints. The tenons had decayed. The pins that held them had crumbled. The beam, heavy, dense Dodona oak, harder and heavier than the surrounding pine, separated from the prow structure and fell. It struck Jason as he slept. It killed him. The man who had survived the clashing rocks. The rocks that Tiphys steered through with seconds to spare. The rocks that Athena herself pushed the hull past with her own hand. The fire-breathing bulls, the earth-born warriors, the dragon that never slept, the bronze giant of Crete, killed by a piece of his own ship falling on him while he napped. The speaking beam of Dodona, the voice of Zeus, the intelligence of the Argo, the one component of the ship that had been more than wood, delivered the final word. Not a prophecy, not a warning, not an argument or an opinion, silence and then the weight of itself and then nothing. Remember the 90-minute threshold, the limit, the 2008 crew hit before exhaustion took over. Jason's entire mythology, from the crossing of the Anorus to the rotting of the Argo, is a story about things that should have been impossible, but happened anyway. And the most impossible thing of all is that the hero at the center of it deserved none of it. I have read this passage in Apollonius, in Diodorus, in the later mythographers. More times than I can count, and I still do not know what to do with it. There is something in this ending that resists interpretation. It is too perfect to be accidental and too bleak to be satisfying. The ship kills its captain. The voice that once spoke kills by falling silent. The man who borrowed everything. The ship, the crew, the fleece, the love of a woman who could break bronze with her mind, is killed by a piece of the vessel that was built for him by a goddess who knew, even as she fitted the planks and sealed the seams, that the man at the helm would never earn what the ship could do. Did Athena know? When she designed the Argo, when she supervised every joint and tenon and coat of pitch? Did she know how it would end? Did the beam of Dodona, when it spoke its first prophecy, already contain the knowledge of its last act? Was the ship's entire existence launched to destruction? A single sentence, spoken by wood in a language that took decades to complete? We do not know. The myth does not explain. It offers the image and walks away. A man, a ship, a beam. Silence. The end. The Argo is gone now, not just the physical ship, the hull, the planks, the Dodona beam, but the world that built her, the last generation of heroes, the fathers of the men who fought at Troy. And they were the last, not in retrospect, not by accident, but by the design of the myth itself. The voyage of the Argo is the final story Greek mythology tells in which things go mostly right. After this, the Trojan War begins. A war nobody wins, a war that destroys every family it touches, a war that even the gods regret starting. The Argonauts were the last crew assembled for a quest that had a prize at the end rather than a siege. The last time the myths gathered heroes together and sent them toward something worth reaching. Everything after the Argo is ruin dressed in glory. The Greeks knew this. The poets who shaped the Argonaut saga positioned it deliberately at the edge of the heroic age as a farewell to the idea that strength and courage and a good ship could carry you to the end of the world and bring you home. After the Argo, that idea died, and even Heracles, the greatest hero of them all, could not finish the voyage. He quit at Medea, wrecked by love, and the myth let him go. Because the age he belonged to was already ending, and even its giants could feel it closing around them. Heracles, left behind in Mysia, calling Hylas's name. Orpheus, who would later descend to the underworld for a woman he loved and lose her by looking back. Castor and Pollux, alternating between life and death for eternity. Peleus, whose son Achilles would be the greatest warrior in history and the most tragic. Medea, who survived everything, who escaped on a dragon-drawn chariot, who went to Athens and then somewhere else, somewhere the sources grow vague. Somewhere the Greek tradition loses track of her as though even mythology could not follow her to wherever she finally came to rest. And Jason, the hero who did nothing. The man who was chosen by gods and loved by a woman who could have ruled the world and crewed by the finest mortals who ever lived, and who, in the end, had nothing except a rotting ship and the memory of a voyage that belonged to everyone but him. The stars are still there. The constellation Argo Navis was one of the original 48 constellations catalogued by Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE. A list assembled roughly 1,800 years after the mythological voyage it memorialized. It was so large that the 18th century astronomer Nicolas Louis de Lacaille divided it into 3 smaller constellations: Carina, the keel; Puppis, the stern; Vela, the sails. The ship is still sailing, broken into its component parts, spread across the southern sky. You cannot see the whole ship from any single point on Earth. You have to travel. You have to move. You have to piece it together from fragments seen at different latitudes, different seasons, different times of night, the way you piece together this story. From Apollonius and Euripides and Pindar and the unnamed poets before them, the way you piece together any age that ended before anyone thought to write it down. If you want to know what happened to Talos, the bronze giant that Medea broke on the shores of Crete, that is another story, for another night. The speaking beam is not among the stars. Dodona oak does not become a constellation. It becomes soil. It becomes the slow, quiet chemistry of decomposition. Cellulose dissolving into sugars, lignin breaking into humic acid, the organized structure of a living thing returning, one molecule at a time, to the undifferentiated earth from which it grew. The voice of Zeus, if it was ever really the voice of Zeus, returned to the ground. The words, whatever they were, however they sounded, whatever warnings and arguments and prophecies they carried, absorbed back into the silence from which all words eventually come and to which all words eventually return. The sacred grove at Dodona still exists, or rather the place exists. The trees are different trees, not the originals, not the oaks that Zeus spoke through, but their descendants. Oak trees live for centuries, not millennia. The grove at Dodona has been replanted, and regrown and replanted again, generation after generation of trees growing in soil that was sacred to a god whose worship faded 2,000 years ago. The wind still moves through the leaves. The sound is the same sound it always was. The rustle and hiss of oak leaves in motion, the particular dry clatter that oak makes in a way that pine does not, that olive does not, that no other tree quite duplicates. If you stood in the grove at Dodona today and closed your eyes and listened to the wind in the leaves, you would hear what the ancient priests heard. What Jason heard in the voice of the beam, on a ship crossing waters that no one had crossed before. You would hear leaves, only leaves. But leaves, moving in wind, make a sound that is very close to whispering. And whispering, if you listen to it long enough, starts to sound like words. The harbor at Pagasae is quiet now. The modern town of Volos sits on the same site. A city of roughly 140,000 people, the third largest port in Greece, roughly 200 miles north of Athens by road, known for its waterfront promenade and its Stiporatica. The small restaurants that serve Sapporo and meze and fresh fish from the Pagasetic Gulf. The waterfront is lined with cafes and the masts of pleasure boats rocking gently in the swell. The hills still rise behind the city, still covered with the same pine forests that provided the timber for the Argo. The water is still sheltered. The wind still funnels through the same channels. If you took a fishing boat out into the center of the Gulf at sunset and cut the engine and drifted, you would see the water turn the color of old copper, then bronze. Then something darker that has no name. And the only sound would be the water against the hull, slow, rhythmic, older than language, at the right hour, when the light is low. When the tourists have gone inside, and the last fishing boat has tied up at the quay and the waterfront is empty except for the cats and the smell of salt, you can almost hear it. Not the voice, not words, not a prophecy or a warning or an argument, but the grain of it, the texture of a sound that used to be there. The space where a voice used to live, still holding the shape of what it carried, the way a shell holds the shape of the creature that lived inside it long after the creature is gone. The Argo sailed this water. She was built on this shore. She carried a voice in her timbers and heroes at her oars, and a golden fleece in her hold. She was the finest ship ever built. She was designed by the smartest goddess in the pantheon, and she was given to a man who did not earn her and could not keep her and who died, in the end, beneath the weight of the one part of her that had been more than wood. Tonight the water is still. The gulf is calm. The hills are dark shapes against a darker sky. The stars are out. The same stars that Tiphys used to navigate, the same stars the rowers saw when they pulled through the night watches. The same stars that shone on the Argo as she crossed the Black Sea at 3 in the morning, moving east through dead water toward the end of the known world. Carina, puppies, Vela, the keel, the stern, the sails, the ship broken into its parts, sailing the sky. Tonight, as you lie here, as the words of this story settle around you the way sediment settles on the floor of a harbor after a ship has passed, I want you to think about the ship. Not the quest, not the hero, not the Golden Fleece or the fire-breathing bulls or the dragon that never slept. The ship, the Argo, the vessel that was smarter than its captain, kinder than its mission, older in some essential way than the story it carried, the ship that could speak, the ship that chose at the end to say nothing, to let its silence be the final word. The water is flat, the sky is deep, the oars are shipped, the sail is furled, the hull rocks gently in the swell. Not the open ocean swell, but the quiet, sheltered movement of water in a harbor, the kind of motion that a body adjusts to without noticing, the kind of rhythm that becomes, after a few minutes, indistinguishable from breathing. The Argo rocks in a harbor that may or may not exist, in a time that may or may not have passed. The pitch on her hull is dry, the planks are warm, the beam of Dodona oak holds its voice. Holds its voice, holds its voice. The only sound is the water against the hull, slow, rhythmic, like breathing, like the breathing of someone who has stopped fighting sleep and is letting it come. Letting the weight of the day dissolve into the warmth of the pillow and the darkness behind their eyelids and the gentle, ancient rhythm of water against wood. You can close your eyes now. If they are not closed already, the voyage is over, the ship is home, The fleece is somewhere, in a temple, in a story, in the fading gold of a sunset on water. It does not matter where. It was always less important than the journey it caused. The water holds you. The stars turn overhead, slowly, the way they have always turned. Karina, puppies, Vela. The ship in the sky, sailing without a crew, without a captain, without a destination. Sailing because that is what ships do. Because the wind fills the sail, and the current takes the hull and the keel cuts the water and the journey continues long after the reason for the journey has been forgotten. Rest now. The beam is silent. The beam has always been silent, in the way that matters. The silence beneath the voice, the quiet at the center of every word, the stillness that was there before the first prophecy, and will be there after the last. The beam is silent. The water is still. The ship rocks gently, and the sea does not remember names. It does not need to. The sea remembers the shape of every hull that ever crossed it, the weight of every keel that ever cut it, the rhythm of every oar that ever pulled through it. It remembers the Argo. Not by name, by the feel of her. The particular way she moved through the water, the specific displacement of a ship that was 92 feet long and 13 feet wide and carried 50 men and a speaking beam of Dodona oak and a golden fleece and a woman who could break bronze with her mind. The sea remembers. The sea holds the memory, the way the harbor holds the ship, quietly, without words, in the language of water against wood. And somewhere, in a city the sources never name, in a room the myths never describe.
you.